Hello and welcome to Seeing Red, a true crime podcast. I'm Mark. Welcome back for another episode. Thank you for joining me once again. Thanks also to our most recent Patreon supporters. So we have Gemma Parker Sheridan, Mark, Katie, Deborah Applegate, RDK, Kate, Megan, Josie Bates, Melanie Donovan, Melanie Nichols, and Rebecca Wilson. Thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you to our other nearly 900 Patreon supporters. The difference that you guys are making right now is it's incredible. It means we're still here doing what we love. It means I've been able to go part-time in my job and devote 2 or 3 days a week to the podcast. And yeah, we're so grateful for your support. So if you're able to, and if you would like to support us in this way, then all you need to do is head over to patreon.com/seeingredpodcast, and we'll see you there for loads of bonus content. Thank you, everybody. And let's crack on with the episode. Picture the scene. It's a bitterly cold January in 1939 on death row at the Colorado State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison. Outside, a storm rages. Icy cold winds and heavy rains howl through the mostly empty halls of the jail. Almost completely impervious to the bitter cold and the grim surroundings, a fully grown 23-year-old prisoner named Joe Arridy. He sits on the floor of his cell, grinning like an infant as he pushes a little wind-up toy train along the cold concrete. He winds up the toy and releases it, giggling and shrieking with childish delight as he gleefully watches it speed along the floor. The guards standing nearby watch in mournful silence. For them, it's a heartbreaking sight. In just a few hours, Joe will be led down the corridor, strapped into a chair and executed in a gas chamber. Colorado law has decreed that this is to be his final night on Earth. And yet Joe, with the mind of a 6-year-old child, doesn't seem to understand that death is waiting for him. It's been explained to him many times, but he cannot truly grasp the concept. Instead of praying or begging for mercy or spending these final hours in fear, Joe chooses instead to play with his toy, happily, innocently, like a carefree little boy. By the time dawn breaks, Joe Arridy will be gone. He will be buried in a prison cemetery beneath a headstone that bears the haunting inscription, "Here lies an innocent man." As you may have already figured out, this week's episode is going to be an intensely sad one, a story that is as devastating as it is important, and we're going to unravel the case of Joe Arridy and ask the questions that should haunt everyone who hears his name. How did a man with the mind of a child end up on death row, convicted of a heinous crime he almost certainly didn't commit? What does his story tell us about justice, about prejudice, and about the way society once treated, and often still treats, those with intellectual disabilities? Joe Arridy is often remembered as the happiest man on death row, and his story is a deeply human example of an intellectual disability tragically misjudged, a wrongful conviction, and the struggle for justice that came way too late. Joe Arridy was born on April the 29th in 1915 in Pueblo, Colorado, a mountain estate in America's Midwest. His parents, Henry and Mary Arridy, were recent immigrants from what was then Ottoman Syria, and they arrived in America as Maronite Christians who had left a mountain village in present-day Lebanon to seek a better life and chase the American dream. Upon arrival in America, the family spoke little English and faced the hardships of immigrant life. Henry found work as a steel mill moulder in Pueblo, and together they raised their family in a humble neighbourhood. Joe was the eldest of their children, and from the beginning it was clear to everyone that he was different. Young Joe did not speak a word until he was about 5 years old, and even then he could only manage a few simple phrases. Neighbours would later recall that as a boy, Joe would rarely play with other children. Instead, he preferred to wander alone, hammering nails into scrap wood or contentedly patting mud pies into shape. His innocence was evident. He smiled often and seemed happiest in his own little world, even as other kids shunned, teased, and outright bullied him for being different to them. Even though Joe Arridy was never officially diagnosed with any kind of spectrum disorder, by today's standards, he was almost certainly autistic. However, this was the early 1920s, and educational support for children with developmental disabilities was virtually non-existent. We knew next to nothing about autism back then. We didn't even have a name for it, much less know how to support those who lived with it. Unsurprisingly, school proved especially difficult for young Joe. He attended only 1 year at Pueblo's Bessemer Elementary School before the principal told his parents that he was an idiot who was not capable of learning and that he should be kept at home so as not to impede the progress of the other children. Joe's parents, worried and unsure how to help their son, struggled to manage his special needs on their own. By age 10, Joe's father felt he had no choice but to seek institutional care. Henry Arridy, Joe's father, had recently lost his job, and being only partially literate himself, he had to ask neighbours for help in writing letters to various state facilities in order to request professional support. Finally, in October 1925, when Joe was 10 years old, he was admitted to the Colorado State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives in Grand Junction. It was a sterile name for what was essentially a mental asylum for those deemed feeble-minded. There, doctors administered IQ tests and literally classified Joe as an imbecile, noting that he was extremely concrete in his thinking and totally unable to think abstractly about anything. Now, as harsh as they were in their assessment of Joe, they weren't wrong. Joe literally couldn't distinguish a stone from an egg or wood from glass. He struggled to count past 5 and didn't know the days of the week. To the clinicians of the era, these results confirmed that Joe's intellectual capacity was profoundly limited, barely even the equivalent to that of a 5 or 6-year-old child. Joe's diagnosis extended beyond him and impacted his family too. In a sign of the prejudices of the time, the institution tested his parents and even a younger brother, concluding that Joe's mother Mary was also feeble-minded and that one of Joe's brothers was a high-grade moron. We've got to pause for a moment here because you may think I'm being harsh or wildly inappropriate with this type of phrasing, but I'm not, for once. These ugly terms, whilst totally unacceptable by 2025 standards, were perfectly valid clinical categories in the 1920s and 1930s, with words like moron, imbecile and idiot being official medical definitions, denoting individuals with low or decreasing IQ ranges. Even so, these conditions carried a heavy stigma, and the Arridy family felt the sting of that undesirable label. Nevertheless, it should be noted that despite his problems, Joe was loved dearly by his parents, and Henry Arridy soon regretted sending his son away to suffer alone in a mental asylum. Less than a year after Joe's commitment, Henry wrote once again to the facility, this time pleading for his boy's return. In August 1926, after only 10 months at the institution, 11-year-old Joe came back home to Pueblo to live with his family. One can only imagine the relief of his parents at having their child back under their roof, hoping they could manage his care themselves despite the challenges. Unfortunately, however, Joe's troubles did not end here. In fact, they only became more complex and difficult to manage as Joe got older. Pueblo in the late 1920s could be a rough place for any teenager, let alone one with severe autism and the mind of a child. To local bullies and predators, Joe was the lowest hanging fruit, a vulnerable target and easy prey for society's evils. In September 1929, when Joe was 14, an horrific incident occurred that would haunt him for years to come and forever alter the course of his life. A group of local boys discovered Joe innocently and happily playing in a field all by himself. Seizing their opportunity, the boys trapped him, beat him and forced him to perform degrading sexual acts on them before raping him. However, the true nightmare was only just beginning for Joe. In the backward logic of society at that time, the blame fell not on the perpetrators, but on Joe. A juvenile probation officer stumbled upon the scene and later wrote a report, grotesquely mischaracterising Joe as the instigator of, quote, nasty and dirty acts. Because the assault involved older boys and boys of another race, the officers declared that Joe's perverse habits made him a menace to the community, and they insisted that it was in the best interests of everyone involved that Joe be returned immediately to the mental asylum. It was a horrific and cruel twist. Joe was painted as a dangerous deviant simply because he had been the victim of an appalling rape. Not only did Joe's attackers not face any kind of punishment, but societal ignorance about intellectual disabilities was so profound that authorities viewed Joe's inability to fend off abuse as evidence of willingness and even worse, moral corruption. In other words, it was far easier to victim blame if the victim was intellectually incapable of defending himself. As a result, Joe, the victim, was sent back to the asylum in 1930. He was about 15 years old when he went back and would remain institutionalised throughout his later teens. Life at the asylum was harsh. Records from his 7-year stay outline a truly depressing routine. Joe could only be taught simple tasks of short duration, like mopping floors or washing dishes. He suffered extreme and persistent bullying due to his disability and often became the butt of cruel jokes by other residents. With his gentle, compliant nature, he was easily manipulated and sometimes beaten by more capable peers. A staff report recounted how Joe would often falsely take the blame for things that he hadn't done, once admitting to stealing cigarettes simply because someone told him to, which was a prime example of just how painfully suggestible he was. Amid such loneliness and mistreatment, Joe did find one supporter, however, a kindly kitchen worker known as Mrs. Bowers. She took him under her wing and supervised his chores with patience, compassion and empathy. She may have been the closest thing to a friend that Joe had in that awful place. Joe's parents periodically tried to bring him home again, writing letters to the institution to plead for his release. But the superintendent firmly refused. He claimed Joe needed to be confined for safety reasons, citing his alleged perverse habits noted in the damning probation report. But in truth, the system had long given up on Joe Arridy, and the powers that be felt a lot better with him hidden away and out of sight. By age 21, Joe had spent most of his life shut away, hidden from view, and labelled as a subhuman and dangerous sexual deviant, when in reality he was a simple, autistic, frightened, childlike young man who had never hurt anyone. The year was 1936, and Joe's life was about to take a fateful turn. Along with a few other residents, Joe managed to escape the confines of the institution and go on the run. However, instead of liberation, Joe walked straight back into a world that was still not prepared to understand or protect him. If there had been even the faintest trace of justice in Joe Arridy's cruel and unforgiving world, his suffering would have ended within the walls of that dreadful asylum on the day he walked out of there. But fate wasn't so kind. For Joe, the nightmare was only just beginning. On a sweltering hot summer's night in mid-August 1936, terror struck Joe Arridy's hometown of Pueblo. The Drain family, who lived in a working-class neighbourhood, suffered an unimaginably brutal attack. Sometime during the night of August 14th, an intruder slipped into the Drain house through an unlocked door. Inside, they crept into a bedroom where 15-year-old Dorothy Drain and her 12-year-old sister Barbara lay sleeping. Armed with a sharp-bladed instrument, later believed to be a hatchet, the intruder raped and then bludgeoned both girls viciously into unconsciousness, leaving them bleeding and dying from catastrophic head wounds. By the time morning came, Dorothy was dead from her wounds. Young Barbara miraculously survived despite severe head injuries, but she was left in a coma that lasted 2 weeks. The girl's parents had been out for the evening, and a younger brother in an adjacent room had heard nothing. The crime was shocking in its brutality. It was so unusually severe that the local media began declaring it the worst crime in American criminal history. The local community in Pueblo responded with terror and outrage, and wondered who among them could commit such a heinous act against 2 children as they slept in their beds. The police launched an immediate murder investigation, and an all-out manhunt was mounted to catch the cruel child killer. In those first frantic days of the investigation, detectives rounded up several suspects, chasing any lead they could find. Witnesses had reported seeing a suspicious man in the neighbourhood described as swarthy, which was an old-fashioned, borderline racist way to describe someone with dark skin back then. This shaky description of the suspect was taken at face value and led police down some prejudiced paths where they focused most of their attention on men of colour, at one point detaining a black homeless man and even an escaped Italian inmate from a state hospital. But those leads were quickly discarded when fingerprints and other evidence didn't match up with the particulars of the crime scene. By August 18th, 4 days after the murder, at least 5 different suspects had been detained for questioning, and the city had posted a $1,000 reward, a seriously hefty sum in 1936. Fear and anger permeated Pueblo. Rumours swirled of a hatchet man on the loose. Parents double-checked locks at night. The press coverage was fevered. Headlines screamed of a hatchet killer. Under enormous public pressure, the police were determined to solve the case quickly. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to anyone in Pueblo, Joe Arridy was on the move that week. But he was nowhere near the Drain home at the time of the murder. On August the 8th, 1936, just a few days before the slaying at the Drain house, the now 21-year-old Joe had made that escape from his asylum, along with a handful of other young men, and had wandered to the railroad yards nearby. There he did something that many other homeless and unemployed drifters were doing throughout the Depression era. He climbed into an empty freight car. The train clattered out of town, carrying Joe into an unknown adventure. Over the next several days, Joe and a fellow runaway rode the rails through Colorado, into Utah, and onto Wyoming. They were train hopping with no particular destination in mind, just happily and innocently enjoying a newfound freedom beyond the institution's walls. The runaway who accompanied Joe on his train adventure, a boy named Ben Harvey, later told authorities that he and Joe did briefly pass through Pueblo, but that it was on August 16th, a full 2 days after the Drain murder, and they only stopped there for a short while anyway. Ben Harvey said they'd arrived in town late at night to visit his family, only to discover they'd moved. The pair then caught the next train out, heading north to Denver. Now, if Ben Harvey's account is accurate, and there's no reason to doubt it, Joe was nowhere near Pueblo on the night that the Drain girls were attacked. On August 20th, 1936, just under a week after the murder, Joe Arridy's wandering journey brought him to the rail yards of Cheyenne in Wyoming. He'd drifted hundreds of miles from Pueblo now. Hungry, tired and dishevelled, Joe approached a parked work train where a travelling kitchen car crew was preparing meals for railway labourers. A kindly couple, Glenn and Julia Gibson, operated the kitchen car. When Joe, a small, polite young man with an obviously simple and childlike demeanour, came up to them asking for something to eat, the Gibsons took pity on him and let him stay with their crew for a few days, giving him clean clothes and letting him wash dishes in exchange for meals. Joe hardly understood where he was headed. He was just glad to have food and friendly faces around. However, a short time later, on August the 26th, the kitchen train prepared to depart Cheyenne for another state, and because Joe wasn't an official worker, the Gibsons reluctantly had to send him on his way. They dropped him back at the Cheyenne rail yard that afternoon, gave him some money, and wished him well on his onward journey. Alone once again, Joe lingered around the rail yard. And it's here that railroad security officers, known as railroad detectives, found him. Seeing a young man in grimy work clothes loitering, they suspected it might be an army deserter from a nearby base, so they accosted him and asked him what he was up to. It should have been plainly obvious to the security officials that Joe was no AWOL soldier on account of how simple-minded and confused he was. Nevertheless, they remained suspicious of him and took him to the local jail, convinced that he must be a fugitive from somewhere or someone who was up to no good. This unremarkable arrest would set off an unfortunate chain of events that would seal Joe's fate. At the jail, Joe was turned over to County Sheriff George J. Carroll for interrogation. This is a name that will be forever entwined with Joe Arridy's fate. Sheriff Carroll was well aware of the highly publicised manhunt going on in Pueblo at the time. Indeed, the brutal Drain murder was making headlines across the region, and the manhunt for the killer was still in full force. When Joe mentioned under questioning that he was from Pueblo, Carroll's interest was immediately piqued. According to Carol's later account, he began casually asking Joe questions, and the conversation took a dark turn. Carol claimed that he asked Joe if he liked girls and inquired whether he had any girlfriends in Pueblo. The shy, simple-minded and utterly confused Joe answered yes to these leading questions, likely just trying to be agreeable and friendly. Carol then pressed, "If you like to go around with girls so much, why do you hurt them?" It was a disgusting accusation, sneakily wrapped up in a question that Joe couldn't possibly have been able to fully grasp, and his reported response was, "Well, I didn't mean to." That was all the opening the sheriff needed. Over the next 90 minutes of interrogation, with no lawyer or friendly adult present, Sheriff Carroll allegedly obtained a confession from Joe Arridy for the assault and murder on the Drain girls. The details of this confession were dubious from the start, and had it happened today, it would have been tossed out of the case file almost immediately. Carroll later told newspapers that Joe admitted attacking the two little girls in Pueblo just for meanness. He did not mention rape at all, and many of his statements were disjointed or just flatly wrong. Critically, Joe did not sign any written confession that day. Carroll didn't bother with a signed statement. Everything the world would soon hear about Joe's supposed confession would come solely from Carroll's mouth. In retrospect, it's painfully obvious that this was a shamelessly coerced false confession, extracted from a scared, intellectually disabled young man who likely had no real understanding of what Carroll was even talking about. As one account later noted, Joe had misspelled his own last name when asked to write it down, and much of what he initially said was quickly disproven. But in the heat of the moment, Sheriff Carroll believed he'd caught the killer, or at least he wanted to believe that. And that was good enough for him. Without wasting any more time, Carroll picked up the phone to call Pueblo's police chief, J. Arthur Grady, and brag that he had the killer. The claim was met with confusion, though. In Pueblo, police had already zeroed in on an entirely different suspect, more on him shortly, and even told Carroll straight that he'd got the wrong man. But Carroll was undeterred. Eager to get credit for solving this notorious crime, he doubled down on his reckless idiocy and immediately alerted the press as well. By the next morning, August the 27th, 1936, the regional newspapers blared gleefully that the Drain murder mystery was solved. A young Pueblo man named Joseph Arridy had confessed to the crime. Other papers across the region picked up the sensational story with lurid headlines like, "Just for meanness, youth admits he killed 15-year-old girl in Pueblo." In Pueblo, people reading the morning news likely felt a wave of relief. The fiend who had harmed the Drain girls had been caught. And boom, just like that, Joe Arridy was branded a murderer and a rapist after a short and sickeningly early example of trial by media. The truth, however, was far from simple. Even as Sheriff Carroll was busy congratulating himself for his spectacular ignorance and piss-poor detective work, the police in Pueblo knew there was a serious complication to overcome now. For days, Pueblo authorities had been building a case against a completely different suspect, a 33-year-old Mexican immigrant named Francisco Aguilar. Significantly, Mr. Drain had fired Aguilar shortly before the murder, reportedly for poor performance. This gave Aguilar a possible motive of resentment and revenge. Moreover, Aguilar's physical appearance, a stocky, dark-complexioned man, unfortunately fit the swarthy stranger image that panicked neighbours had circulated in the early days of the manhunt. Suspicion against Aguilar had actually arisen on the day of Dorothy Drain's funeral. In a bizarre turn of events, Aguilar had shown up to the funeral uninvited and dressed in dirty work overalls. He'd cut into the line of mourners viewing Dorothy's casket, not once but twice. He even pushed some money into Mr. Drain's hand, mumbling that it was to help the family. Witnesses thought Aguilar's behaviour was disturbing and highly suspicious. When police approached him shortly after the funeral, he kept hinting at how close he was to the Drain family, trying to ingratiate himself in a way that set off alarm bells. Pueblo officers promptly took Aguilar into custody for questioning. Initially, he denied any involvement, and his mother provided an alibi, insisting Aguilar was at home on the night of the murder. However, within days, forensic evidence cracked the story wide open. Scrapings from under Aguilar's fingernails tested positive for tiny fibres of blue chenille, the exact same material of the bedspread on the drained girl's bed where they were viciously attacked. It was a damning find, and almost straight away Pueblo police considered Frank Aguilar their prime suspect. So when Sheriff Carroll triumphantly informed Pueblo police of Joe Arridy's confession, it immediately threw a spanner into the works.
This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. World Mental Health Day takes place on the 10th of October, and this year BetterHelp is shining the spotlight on therapists, people who truly make the world a better place. The right therapist can change everything, and BetterHelp has over 12 years of experience in matching people to the right therapist. BetterHelp therapists work according to a strict code of conduct. They are fully qualified in the UK, and yes, they do match you with a therapist and would identify the right therapist for you, but if you're not happy with that match, you can also switch to a different therapist at any time. And with over 30,000 therapists worldwide, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. And it works with an average rating of 4.9 out of 5 for a live session based on 1.7 million client reviews. So this World Mental Health Day, we are celebrating the therapists who've helped millions of people take a step forward. And if you're ready to find the right therapist for you, BetterHelp can help you start that journey. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/red. That's betterhelp.com/red.
Indeed, that same day, only hours after Joe's supposed confession had made headlines, the chief of Pueblo Police called Carroll back with an update. Aguilar had also confessed. Faced with the physical evidence and the likely harsh interrogation, Frank Aguilar broke down on August the 28th and admitted to the crime. He told police that yes, he had attacked the drain girls out of revenge for being fired by their father. Now Pueblo had 2 confessions from 2 different men for the same murder. How could that possibly be? Sheriff Carroll, being somewhat ironically the biggest moron in this entire story, declined to just admit that he'd made a terrible mistake and instead doubled down on his accusation against Joe. He came up with a bizarre, completely baseless theory that both men must have been involved, that Joe Arridy and Frank Aguilar had acted as a team. The story quickly morphed into a tale of 2 predators randomly crossing paths. Carroll, still determined to be the hero of the hour, arranged a dramatic confrontation by bringing Joe Arridy and Frank Aguilar face to face at Colorado State Prison. The authorities told each man that the other had implicated him, hoping that one would definitively roll over on the other. On September the 2nd, 1936, District Attorney French L. Taylor oversaw a joint interrogation of both suspects at the prison, with Warden Best taking notes. The result was a 5-page typed statement in which Frank Aguilar answered a series of 6 pre-written questions. Every question was loaded, each phrase to include Joe Arridy in the narrative. Was Joe Arridy with you when X happened, for example? To every question, a weary and defeated Aguilar answered yes, implicating Joe by default. It was a farce of a confession. Aguilar provided no details beyond agreeing to those leading questions, and Joe himself sat silently throughout the interrogation, saying nothing at all. In fact, Joe refused to sign the final statement. Only Aguilar signed it, and with an X because he was illiterate. The local Pueblo chieftain newspaper dutifully reported this new narrative. Joe Arridy and Frank Aguilar, a pair of sexual deviants, had randomly met in Pueblo on the night of August 14th, and together carried out this vile attack. The story went that Aguilar had a premeditated plan and let Arridy tag along for the thrill. Afterwards, Joe supposedly hopped on a freight train out of town, while Aguilar stayed behind. It was an almost absurd scenario, but it satisfied the public's need for a tidy resolution. 2 monsters, not just one, were responsible, and both were now behind bars and the community was once again safe. But behind the scenes, cracks in this tale were already showing. Frank Aguilar quickly retracted his second confession. He told anyone who would listen that Warden Best and the police had threatened him with terrible things if he didn't go along and implicate Joe. According to one account, Aguilar feared he'd be lynched or extrajudicially killed if he refused. They allegedly warned there'd be a dead Mexican if he didn't say what they wanted. Given the era's prevalent racial prejudices and the lynch mob atmosphere surrounding the case, indeed, after Aguilar's arrest, a mob pamphlet had circulated calling for a necktie party to hang him, his fear was not unfounded. Aguilar retracting his confession didn't change much for him, though. He was already destined for trial and ultimately the death penalty, on the strength of his initial confession and also the physical evidence. But his retraction further undermined the case against Joe Arridy. If Aguilar maintained Joe wasn't involved and all the objective evidence pointed only to Aguilar, why pursue Joe at all? Tragically, in 1936, law enforcement and prosecutors were loath to admit to any wrongdoing. They had a signed confession from Aguilar and a hearsay confession from Joe via Sheriff Carroll. The public was convinced both men were guilty too, so they pressed ahead against Joe Arridy despite the glaring issues. When Joe was shipped back to Colorado to face charges, authorities feared enraged citizens might take justice into their own hands. Special precautions were put into place to shield this feeble-minded youth from lynch mobs along the way. In that moment, Joe was seen as vulnerable enough to pity, yet paradoxically, the justice system would later cast him as calculating enough to stand trial as a cold-blooded murderer. This was just nuts. One more episode underscored Joe's pathological suggestibility. While he was awaiting trial, a 28-year-old woman in Colorado Springs named Helen O'Driscoll was attacked and beaten. This was on the 23rd of August, and this was about a week after the Drain murder. She'd survived, and when she later saw Joe Arridy's photograph in the paper, she identified him as her assailant. When police asked Joe about it, he confessed to that attack as well. The only problem, Joe could not have possibly committed it, because at that time he was working with the kitchen crew hundreds of miles away. Indeed, eyewitnesses and employment records placed him firmly in Wyoming at the time. Joe's false confession to a completely separate crime shows just how readily he would agree to accusations that were put to him. He was utterly pliable under authority. It was clear that Joe was trying to please his interrogators, parroting back what he thought they wanted to hear, without any grasp of the implications. By late 1936, the stage was set. Frank Aguilar was tried for Dorothy Drain's murder first. In December 1936, he was convicted in a swift trial. The jury deliberated for just 28 minutes. When he was sentenced to death, he was executed in the Colorado State Prison's gas chamber on August 13, 1937. Before his execution, Aguilar took responsibility for another violent incident, the murder of an elderly woman and the attack on her family earlier that August. And he maintained that he alone was the Pueblo hatchet killer. None of that would save Joe, though. The wheels of injustice were now firmly set in motion. In April 1937, Joe Arridy went on trial in Pueblo for the murder of Dorothy Drain. His case was perplexing. The actual killer, Aguilar, was already convicted and awaiting his own execution. Yet here was Joe, a second defendant, being tried as a co-conspirator in the same crime. Public opinion in Pueblo was divided in an unusual way. On the one hand, many citizens were bloodthirsty for justice. 2 innocent girls had been attacked and one of them was killed, and if there were 2 perpetrators, by God they should both pay. The newspapers had trumpeted Joe's confession too. Headlines called him an imbecile slayer and printed every lurid claim from the police. But on the other hand, even in 1937, some observers felt a pang of sympathy or doubt. Joe's childlike demeanour was obvious to anyone who saw him. When reporters saw him in jail before the trial, they noted that he spent his time happily playing with a toy car, utterly unconcerned about the prospect of execution. The warden there, Roy Best, who had custody of Joe during the trial preparations, described him as the happiest man who ever lived on death row, a moniker that would stick. It was as if Joe couldn't comprehend the gravity of his situation, and that itself made some people uneasy about punishing him. Joe's defence at trial was mounted by a local attorney, but soon a larger figure stepped in to direct proceedings. Gail L. Ireland, a prominent Denver lawyer and future Colorado Attorney General, who had taken an interest in the case. In a sign of how concerned the warden and others were, it was actually Warden Roy Best who helped enlist Gail Ireland to defend Joe. Best did not want to see this guileless young man die for a crime he was convinced that he didn't commit. With limited tools at their disposal, Ireland and the defence pursued an insanity strategy. Essentially, they conceded that if Joe had done the act, then he was not guilty by reason of insanity or mental deficiency. 3 state psychiatrists who examined Joe testified that he was, in clinical terms, insane, or at least of such limited intellect that he could not fully be responsible. They talked about his IQ, measured at around 46, and his mental age, around 6. However, legal insanity in that era was narrowly defined as the inability to distinguish right from wrong, and the prosecution insisted that Joe knew right from wrong and had maliciously participated in the crime. They leaned heavily on Sheriff Carroll's testimony about the confession and on the written statement where Aguilar, under duress, had said Joe was there. The trial was swift. In truth, Joe never stood a chance. The jury was composed of ordinary townspeople of the 1930s who likely had little understanding of intellectual disability beyond fear and misconception. They saw before them a diminutive man who often wore a vacant smile and didn't seem to follow everything that was happening. To a sympathetic observer, these were signs of a man with the mind of a child. But to others, Joe's odd behaviour belied a lack of remorse, or even a sly indifference. Over the course of the trial, Joe himself barely spoke. When he did, his answers were simple and often confused. He had to be coached to respond to the judge. The press reported that he seemed more interested in the shiny objects in the courtroom or in the patterns on the wallpaper than in the testimony about him. Sheriff George Carroll took the stand and confidently recounted how Joe had confessed. No one seriously interrogated Carroll's methods on the stand. The inconsistencies and lack of a signed confession were glossed over. Likewise, the dubious joint questioning with Aguilar wasn't dwelled upon, except to introduce that typed statement implicating Joe. The fact that Aguilar had retracted that statement never truly registered with the jury. How ironic that in the one trial where understanding the defendant's mental capacity was absolutely critical, the proceedings sailed right past it. The district attorney urged the jury to focus on the brutality of the crime and not let a guilty man escape. He painted Joe as possibly even more depraved for having a weak mind, suggesting that such people had criminal tendencies or moral imbecility. After a short deliberation, the jury found Joe Arridy guilty of first-degree murder on April the 24th, 1937. The verdict came with a mandatory sentence: death. When the judge asked Joe if he had anything to say before sentencing, he reportedly nodded and smiled, completely unaware of what had just happened. In fact, one reporter observed that when his verdict was read, Joe was busy drawing doodles on a piece of paper. He looked up curiously when people around him gasped, then went back to his scribbling. This is how detached from reality he was in that moment. The judge pronounced the ultimate punishment. Joe Arridy was to be executed by lethal gas. In the 1930s, Colorado, like many states, used gas chambers for capital punishment, a method that at the time was seen to be modern. A date was set for Joe's execution, and his story might have ended swiftly here, just as Frank Aguilar's had, if not for the extraordinary efforts of a few individuals who simply could not stomach the thought of killing this childlike man. What followed was a remarkable 2-year fight to save Joe's life, a fight that would play out in the courtrooms, in the governor's office, and in the court of public opinion. While lawyers filed appeals and motions in faraway courts, Joe Arridy was sent to death row at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City to await his fate. There, in a tiny cell, Joe astonished everyone. Far from being anxious or distraught, as most condemned men would be, Joe was, in his own simple way, happy. He didn't fully understand that he'd been committed to death. To him, the prison was not a terrifying dungeon, but something closer to a safe home. For the first time in his life, he had his own warm bed, regular meals, and people were kind to him. The warden, Roy Best, though a famously gruff man with other inmates, treated Joe in a gentle, almost fatherly manner. Seeing Joe's innocence, Best brought him little gifts, a toy tin train, a little car, some colouring pencils. These toys lit Joe up with joy. He spent his days playing on the cell floor like a small boy, winding up the toy train and watching it jog a short distance until it derailed and crashed, then gleefully winding it up and starting all over again. Other condemned prisoners, hardened murderers and felons, found themselves charmed by Joe's spirit. When he sent his wind-up train careering down the cell block corridor, another inmate in a nearby cell would reach through the bars, set it back on its wheels, wind it up and send it trundling back to Joe. They essentially played catch with a toy train, back and forth, along the death row tier. The image is almost too poignant to believe. In the bleakest corner of the prison, lined with men awaiting doom, Joe Arridy's laughter could be heard echoing off the concrete. Joe became a favourite of the guards too. Many of these seasoned prison officers had never encountered a prisoner quite like Joe. He called the guards friend and was quick to flash a big grin at even the slightest act of kindness. If a guard gave him a piece of candy or an extra dessert from the mess hall, Joe reacted as if it were Christmas morning. In return, he would sometimes draw simple crayon pictures and proudly give them to the guards as gifts. Warden Best, seeing how much Joe loved desserts, made sure the kitchen sent ice cream frequently to his cell. In fact, ice cream became Joe's absolute favourite treat. He'd eat it over any normal meal, just like a child. During his time on death row, whenever he was asked what he wanted to eat, Joe invariably answered, ice cream. It got to the point that he was having it for breakfast, lunch and dinner. The prison chaplain, Father Albert Shaler, also took a deep interest in Joe's well-being. Father Shaler would visit Joe regularly, not so much to discuss the soul, Joe's comprehension of theology was minimal, but to offer company and comfort. They would often sit together while Joe played, and the chaplain would gently ask him questions about his childhood, or play word games with him to keep him occupied. Reporters who were occasionally permitted to peer in on death row marvelled at Joe's demeanour. One newspaper dubbed him the happiest prisoner on death row. It wasn't a stretch. Joe truly seemed content. In his naivety, he believed for a long time that he would eventually go home. Perhaps he thought all prisoners got released one day, or that if he behaved well, the governor would send him back to his parents. He had no real concept of execution. When other inmates tried delicately to explain to Joe that he might be punished by gas, he just didn't grasp it. One inmate recalled Joe saying the gas chamber was for bad people, and he hadn't been bad, had he? Death row is usually a place of agony. Men wrestling with their guilt or proclaiming innocence, writing final letters, raging at their fate. For Joe, it was a playground insulated from the cruelty of the outside world. In Pueblo, people called him a monster. In Cannon City's death house, he was a mascot of sorts, a young man who everyone recognised as being utterly out of place among the cold-blooded killers. The irony was keen. Joe Arridy had never been safer or more cared for in his life than when he was in prison awaiting execution. As author Robert Persk later wrote, Joe felt safe in the Colorado State Penitentiary. He had food, a bed, and was treated well by prisoners and guards alike. For a time, he likely even forgot the trial and his sentence. But outside those walls, a battle raged to secure Joe a future beyond those prison games. Gale L. Ireland was not a man who gave up easily. After Joe's conviction, Ireland took up the case in earnest, determined to stop what he saw as a gross miscarriage of justice. Over the next 2 years, Ireland spearheaded a whirlwind of legal activity on Joe's behalf. He filed a flurry of appeals, motions and petitions, and 9 separate stays of execution were obtained. These delays stretched Joe's case out through 1937 and into 1938. Each stay granted was a small victory that bought Joe a little more time. But a stay of execution was only temporary. Ireland's ultimate goal was a permanent solution, either a new trial or clemency. One of Ireland's key tactics was to challenge Joe's sanity, not in the moral sense that had failed at trial, but in the legal sense of competence. Ireland prepared a petition to the Colorado Supreme Court requesting a full hearing on Joe Arridy's sanity. Essentially, he argued that executing a man who was so clearly mentally deficient would be a travesty. He wanted Joe evaluated under a legal standard for sanity and competence. In a personal letter to a friend around this time, Ireland did not mince words about what he felt was happening. Quote, "If he is gassed, it will take a long time for the state of Colorado to live down the disgrace." End quote. In another letter, he flatly stated that if the execution went ahead, the state would be committing a murder itself. These were extraordinary statements. A defence attorney openly calling a potential execution by the state a murder. But Ireland's conviction was unshakable. Joe was innocent, or at the very least not culpable, and killing him would leave an indelible stain on Colorado's conscience. Ireland wasn't alone. Warden Best quietly supported Ireland's efforts, providing any help he could. Father Shaler, the chaplain, certainly prayed for Joe's reprieve and likely made his own appeals to the governor. Outside the prison, a small but passionate circle of advocates and journalists had started to rally. Daniel Leonetti, a young reporter from Trinidad in Colorado, followed Joe's case and wrote impassioned articles questioning the evidence. Michael A. Radelet, a sociologist and death penalty expert, would later note how many flaws there were in the conviction. Arridy didn't have access to a lawyer and seems to have been pushed into a confession by Sheriff Carroll. It's almost as if the confession was spoon-fed. But in the late 1930s, there was no Innocence Project, no widespread concept of wrongful convictions. The public's trust in law enforcement was high. It was an uphill battle to convince courts or the governor to undo a jury verdict. Nevertheless, Ireland pressed on every front. He appealed to Governor Teller Ammons repeatedly for clemency. Governor Ammons, who held office from 1937 into early 1939, agonised over the case. Clemency, commuting a death sentence to life in prison, was a political hot potato. If Ammons showed mercy and the public disagreed, it could harm him. The family of Dorothy Drain Shawley wanted justice to be carried out, and so, despite his misgivings, Governor Ammons did not act to pardon or commute Joe's sentence. He essentially left it to the courts. Ireland's final legal stand came when he managed to get the Colorado Supreme Court to consider a last-minute sanity hearing in late 1938. This was the last appeal. If it failed, Joe would be out of options. In a heart-wrenching decision, the state Supreme Court denied the petition by a single vote. And that was it. The stays of execution had run out now. A new execution date was set, January the 6th, 1939. Joe Arridy was going to be put to death at the start of the new year. Gale Ireland was devastated. He had fought for every legal delay possible, wrung every argument he could out of the system, but in the end the system's momentum toward execution would not be stopped. In his final letters, Ireland expressed despair and disgust. He warned that Colorado was about to execute a child in all but name. Years later, Ireland's daughter would recall that this case haunted him for the rest of his life. He carried a photograph of Joe Arridy in his briefcase as a reminder of the cause of mercy and justice that fell short. As Ireland and others reluctantly braced for the inevitable, Joe remained characteristically innocent of the drama. In December 1938, as the last appeal failed, Joe spent his Christmas on death row, singing carols that Father Shaler taught him, enjoying a special holiday dessert from the warden, and excitedly showing guards a crayon drawing he'd made of Santa Claus. The notion that these were his final days simply didn't register with him. January 6th, 1939. The sun set early on that winter day in Cannon City, casting a long shadow over the stone walls of Colorado State Penitentiary. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was grim and hushed. Staff and inmates alike knew what the night would bring. At 8 p.m, Warden Roy Best made the walk down to Joe Arridy's cell. He carried with him the official death warrant, the piece of paper authorising Joe's execution, and behind him trailed the required 50 witnesses and officials who would observe the event. But in the hours before the final procession, an achingly poignant scene unfolded in Joe's cell. Father Shayler, the Catholic chaplain, arrived with a special treat for Joe, a bowl of ice cream. It was a last meal request Joe had clung to. Ice cream, only ice cream, just as he'd had for breakfast and lunch that day. Joe gleefully began eating it as Father Shayler, voice quivering, gently said it was time to perform the last rites. He had to explain to Joe that this was a kind of prayer. To ensure Joe could follow, the chaplain spoke slowly, 2 or 3 words at a time, and had Joe repeat the phrases of the sacrament after him. In the name of the Father. Joe echoed the words obediently, and even made the sign of the cross over himself, which he'd practiced. When the ritual was finished, Joe didn't break down or weep. He simply smiled at Father Shayler, thanked him, and then, incredibly, went right back to playing with his toy train on the floor. The sight brought tears to the eyes of the hardened guard standing nearby. Here was a young man mere hours from death, but he had the guileless composure of a boy engrossed in his playthings, protected by his innocence of what was to come. Finally, at around 9:30 p.m, Warden Best could delay no longer. He entered the cell quietly and placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. Best's voice was low and strained as he read aloud the death warrant, the formal declaration that Joe Arridy was to be executed that night for the murder of Dorothy Drain. Joe paused and looked up at the warden. Best carefully asked, "Do you understand, Joe?" For the first time a flicker of realization came across his face. "They're killing me," he replied vacantly. It's unclear if Joe truly understood that that meant he would die, or if he was simply parroting words he'd heard, but those words stunned those present. Warden Best nodded, his throat tight, and gently said something like, "I'm afraid so, Joe." Joe had no further questions. He stood up, and one of the guards helped straighten his shirt. The march to the gas chamber began. Joe's hands were cuffed in front of him, but he wasn't shackled or dragged. In fact, he walked willingly, even gazing curiously at the line of solemn observers who fell in step behind him. Among them were reporters, officials, a doctor, the undertaker, all mandated by law to witness the execution. Absent notably were any members of the Drain family. Dorothy's parents and siblings chose not to watch Joe die. They perhaps felt that one execution, Aguilar's, had been enough and couldn't bear another, or maybe they had concerns about the conviction. As Joe stepped out of his cell, he carried something in his hands, his beloved toy train. He'd insisted on bringing it along, holding it as tightly as if it were a security blanket. Warden Best had allowed it. As they neared the chamber, Warden Best quietly asked Joe if he wanted to leave the toy train behind with someone for safekeeping. Joe paused and then turned to a fellow inmate, a man in a nearby cell who had befriended him during those long months. Joe handed the train through the bars to that prisoner and simply said, "Here, you can play with it. I won't need it where I'm going." He didn't sound sad, just matter of fact. Perhaps he thought he'd get another toy wherever he was going next, or perhaps Father Shayler's stories of heaven had convinced him that he'd have new wonders to play with. They entered the execution chamber, a steel room shaped like a large vault. In the centre was a chair, a strong wooden armchair bolted to the floor, with straps for the arms, legs and chest. It was commonly called the chair, though it was inside the gas chamber. Joe gazed around with a half smile as if taking in a peculiar new place. Under the harsh electric lights, Warden Best guided Joe to sit down in the chair. Joe complied calmly. Guards then began fastening the leather straps around his limbs and torso. As they buckled the final strap across his chest, observers saw Joe's famous grin finally fade. Perhaps the restraints frightened him or caused discomfort. His face took on a confused, fearful look. Father Shayler, standing just outside the sealed doorway, quickly said, "Joe, remember what we talked about heaven." It said that Joe managed to feign a smile and replied, I want to play the harp like the padre told me. Earlier, the priest had apparently comforted Joe with images of angels in heaven, playing harps and living in joy. In Joe's final lucid moment, he clung to that childlike fantasy of heaven. He imagined himself not burning in eternal hell, as some preachers might have threatened, but playing a harp among angels, maybe raising the chickens he'd once talked about wanting on a farm in the sky. Ward Best, choking back tears now, asked Joe if he had any last words. Joe thought for a moment and then softly said, No, and then added, as if reassuring his friends, no one's mad at me anymore. It was an innocent's way of saying he felt forgiven or at peace. At 9:39 p.m, Warden Best and Father Shayler had to leave the chamber. They both stepped out, and as they did, both men quietly said goodbye. Shayler with a whispered prayer, Best with a husky, "Goodbye, Joe." The heavy steel door swung shut with a foreboding clang, sealing Joe inside the airtight chamber, all by himself. Through a glass porthole, witnesses could see Joe strapped in the chair, blindfolded, his small frame so slight against the back of the seat. A prison official gave a final signal, and the executioner pulled a lever. Underneath Joe's chair, crystals of cyanide dropped into a vat of sulfuric acid, immediately creating a cloud of lethal hydrogen cyanide gas. For a moment there was silence. Joe apparently heard the faint hiss and sniffed. Some say he remarked, "I smell something funny," before the toxic fumes took his consciousness. He never struggled. Within seconds Joe's head slumped. He died quietly, with none of the convulsions that sometimes accompanied gassing. Outside the chamber, a silent tension broke into a flurry of sobs from a few who had not held their composure. Grown men, reporters, guards, wiped their eyes. The prison's doctor checked his stopwatch. After about 11 minutes, he peered through the window and pronounced Joe Arridy dead. It was official. The state of Colorado had executed a man who moments before had spoken of playing a harp with angels. As Joe's body was removed, a sense of shame mixed with sorrow pervaded the room. Roy Best, a man not known for soft-heartedness, removed his hat and murmured a prayer. The witnesses filed out into the cold night air, many stunned by what they'd just seen. One official, an eyewitness to the execution, was so overcome that he collapsed and died of a heart attack shortly after leaving that chamber, as if the weight of what he'd witnessed was literally too much for his heart to take. Joe's execution came 17 months after Frank Aguilar's. In a grim coincidence, Aguilar had gone to the gas chamber on August 13th, 1937, and one of the official witnesses to Aguilar's death also died of a heart attack right afterwards. It's as if fate recorded its protest in the only way it knew how. As I mentioned earlier, the Drain family chose not to attend Joe's execution, but one can only imagine their conflicted emotions. The case was now closed in the eyes of the law. Both men accused of Dorothy's murder were now dead. Yet had justice truly been done? An eye for an eye was satisfied in the most literal sense, but it felt to many like the state had just taken an eye from an innocent. Joe Arridy was buried on a barren hill behind the prison, in an intimate cemetery grimly nicknamed Woodpecker Hill. Executed prisoners without family to claim them were often laid to rest there under simple markers. At the time of Joe's burial, there wasn't even a proper headstone, just a round, rusty tin marker stamped with a number. No name, no dates. But that wouldn't be Joe's final memorial. In the days immediately following the execution, Colorado newspapers carried the story of Joe Arridy's death. Some stuck to a dispassionate approach. "Imbecile slayer of girl dies in gas chamber" was a typical headline, emphasising the state's view that justice had been served. But other pieces hinted at the unease surrounding the case. The Pueblo chieftain, in an editorial, acknowledged that many people felt it was unconscionable that Arridy was sentenced to death, and that a dark cloud hung over his execution. Indeed, numerous people at the time, from average citizens to legal professionals, believed that Joe had been wrongfully convicted. As Denver attorney David Martinez later observed, Joe's case became something of a cause célèbre among those concerned with justice for the mentally disabled. Warden Roy Best, who had tried so hard to save Joe, was deeply affected. He reportedly said in private that this was the saddest duty he had ever carried out as a warden. Father Shaler, in his homilies, spoke of Joe as a lamb among wolves. Even some law enforcement officers quietly conceded that the evidence against Joe had been paper thin. Yet officially the case was closed and largely forgotten by the broader public as the years passed. The 1940s and 1950s came and went, and Joe Arridy's name faded from the headlines. However, Joe was not entirely forgotten. His story lived on in the memories of those who had been close to it, and it would periodically resurface as an example of injustice. In 1955, Gale Ireland, by then a respected former Attorney General of Colorado, delivered a public speech in which he called the trial and execution of Joe Arridy, quote, "the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of Colorado." It was a bold statement, but Ireland had never wavered in his belief that an innocent, incapable man had been put to death. His advocacy planted seeds that later generations would nurture. By the 1990s, the death penalty itself was under renewed scrutiny in the United States, and wrongful convictions were being brought to light with alarming regularity. In 1992, the US Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute someone who was insane. And in 2002, the court went further in Atkins v. Virginia, declaring it unconstitutional to execute individuals with intellectual disability, acknowledging that their mental capacity lessens their culpability and that they are too prone to false confessions and other errors of justice. Reading that decision, one cannot help but think of Joe Arridy. Governor Bill Ritter later explicitly noted that it would be unconstitutional today to impose a death penalty on anyone as intellectually disabled as Arridy. In other words, what happened to Joe in 1939 could not legally happen in 2011. Unfortunately for Joe, these legal protections came 63 years too late. In 1995, a Denver authority and disability rights advocate named Robert Persk published a book titled Deadly Innocence, wholly dedicated to investigating Joe Arridy's case. Persk meticulously chronicled Joe's life and the evidence, arguing powerfully that he was innocent. Persk's research shed even more light on how egregiously Joe had been railroaded. The book galvanised a small group of Coloradans to take action. They formed the Friends of Joe Arridy, a group devoted to clearing Joe's name and preserving his memory. One of their first acts was deeply symbolic. In 2007, they raised funds to give Joe Arridy a proper tombstone. They found Joe's unmarked grave on Woodpecker Hill, among many forgotten prisoners' resting places. And in May 2007, they installed a 2-foot-tall granite headstone there, engraved with Joe's name, his date of birth and death date, and even an etching of a toy train chugging along, a tribute to the little wind-up train that had given him so much joy on death row. At the base of the tombstone, they inscribed the words that friends like Warden Best had always believed to be true. Here lies an innocent man. The dedication ceremony at Joe's gravesite was attended by a number of people, some old enough to remember 1939, others much younger who only knew of Joe from Persk's book or local law. Among those present was David A. Martinez, the Denver attorney of a new generation, whom the Friends of Joe Arridy had enlisted to help with their ultimate goal, a posthumous pardon. They intended to ask the governor of Colorado to formally clear Joe Arridy's name. It was a long shot. Posthumous pardons are extremely rare, especially for someone executed so long ago. But Joe's case was special. As Professor Michael Radillot noted, only a handful of posthumous pardons have been granted in death penalty cases across the country. It's not unheard of, but it takes some political manoeuvring. The Friends of Joe Arridy began organising their evidence, affidavits and public support. They timed their effort for late 2010, when Governor Bill Ritter, himself a former prosecutor, was preparing to leave office. Perhaps, they thought, an outgoing governor might be willing to grant this act of justice without fear of political consequences. Governor Ritter received the petition compiled by Martinez, which included trial transcripts, Persk's research, and contemporaneous news articles. Ritter studied the materials and also consulted with experts on false confessions and intellectual disability. The weight of evidence and historical analysis pointed to one conclusion. Joe Arridy had almost certainly been innocent, and even if he wasn't, he never should have been convicted or executed. And so, on January the 7th, 2011, Governor Bill Ritter made history. He granted a full and unconditional posthumous pardon to Joseph Arridy, 72 years after his execution. This was the first time in Colorado's history that a governor had pardoned someone who'd already been executed. In his written statement, Ritter called Joe's case a tragic conviction based on a false and coerced confession. He explicitly noted how Joe had been browbeaten by Sheriff Carroll back in Cheyenne. Ritter also reflected on the progress society had made, stating that it would be unconstitutional today to impose the death penalty on anyone as intellectually disabled as Arridy. Governor Ritter's pardon statement was sombre and reflective. One line that stands out poignantly, quote, "Pardoning Arridy cannot undo this tragic event in Colorado history. It is in the interests of justice and simple decency, however, to restore his good name." Ritter acknowledged that nothing could bring Joe back to life or erase the injustice of his death. But at least on the record, the state of Colorado would now admit that Joe Arridy died an innocent man. In a press conference, Ritter also expressed personal remorse, noting that as a former prosecutor he found Joe's case especially heartbreaking, a stark reminder of how the desire for retribution can sometimes blind the system to truth. The news of Joe's pardon made national headlines. Reuters, the Associated Press and media outlets across the country ran stories on it. Joe Arridy's smiling mugshot, a photograph of him from 1936, with an open, almost goofy grin, accompanied many of these stories. In that photo, Joe truly looks like a carefree kid, not a killer. The world, seeing that image anew in 2011, reacted with compassion. People were struck by the tale of the happiest man on death row, a man who went to his death smiling and playing, not understanding the evil done to him. In Pueblo, opinion had long shifted. Dorothy Drain's surviving sister Barbara, who recovered from her injuries and lived a relatively quiet life, didn't publicly comment on the pardon, but sources close to the family indicated they accepted that Joe likely had not been involved. Today, Joe Arridy's grave is no longer a forlorn, numbered marker among weeds. It's become a little shrine. Visitors often leave small toys, especially toy trains, in memory of the simple joys that sustained him. Flowers, coins and notes are commonly found there as well. Joe's story is taught in some criminal justice classes as a cautionary tale about false confessions and the importance of protecting the rights of vulnerable suspects. He's also been remembered in art and media. A play was written about his life, and a screenplay entitled The Woodpecker Waltz was crafted by Daniel Leonetti, focusing on Gale Island's heroic efforts. In 2013, Joe Arridy was inducted into the Colorado Criminal Justice Hall of Fame, not as a criminal, but as someone whose case changed minds and laws about the death penalty and mental disability. The tragedy of Joe Arridy forces us to confront how society and the justice system viewed people with intellectual disabilities in the 1930s. It was an era of profound ignorance and prejudice towards the so-called feeble-minded. The very term suggests how people like Joe were seen, as flawed, lesser humans. In those days, psychological science was crude. IQ tests were new and often misused. Terms like imbecile and moron were thrown around in courtrooms and newspapers, branding individuals for life. There was a popular but cruel theory that people of low intelligence were more prone to criminality or immorality. Joe himself was a victim of that thinking. Recall how the probation officer assumed Joe's assault was consensual and evidence of Joe's depravity. That officer's words, "I cannot understand why boys of the mentality of this one are allowed to return home," echoed the eugenic sentiment of the time. In 1927, the US Supreme Court in Buck v. Bell infamously upheld forced sterilisation for the intellectually disabled, with Justice Holmes declaring, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It was in that harsh climate that Joe grew up. Within the justice system of the 1930s, few safeguards existed for someone like Joe. Police could interrogate a suspect for hours on end with no lawyer or appropriate adult present, and they did. Confessions, even dubious ones, were considered gold standard evidence. There was little understanding of how a frightened, suggestible person might just agree to whatever story a commanding officer put forth. False confessions were hardly acknowledged as a phenomenon. Joe's case, though known to some at the time, was largely chalked up as a fluke or, to believers in his guilt, proof that even the feeble-minded can be cunning killers. The possibility that he confessed falsely under coercion was not something the average 1930s juror or judge was prepared to grasp. Contrast that with today. We know that intellectually disabled individuals are particularly vulnerable to giving false confessions, as they often wish to please authority figures and may not comprehend the consequences. Modern police protocols, at least in many places, take special care when dealing with suspects with obvious cognitive impairments, often ensuring a lawyer or advocate is present and that any waiver of rights is truly understood. Likewise, the courts now have competency hearings. Before a defendant's trial starts, if there is any doubt about their ability to understand the proceedings or assist in their own defence, a competency evaluation is done. Had such a process existed in 1937, Joe Arridy would likely have been found incompetent to stand trial, meaning the trial should not have proceeded until he was deemed capable, which in his case would probably have been never, given his mental capacity. Instead, back then, they did a perfunctory sanity evaluation and declared him sane in the sense that he wasn't floridly psychotic. The fact that he couldn't count past 5 or recall what day it was didn't legally matter to the court. Today, it would matter immensely. Public attitudes have also progressed. In Joe's time, some newspapers cruelly nicknamed him the imbecile killer or the half-wit slayer. The stigma was such that executing an imbecile did not prompt the universal outcry one might expect. Some even saw it as removing a burden from society. But there were those, even then, who saw the fundamental injustice of it. The Denver Post ran an editorial noting that executing a man with the mind of a child was an act more barbaric than the crime he was accused of. Ordinary citizens wrote letters to the governor pleading for mercy for Joe, not because they all thought that he was innocent, but because the thought of putting a feeble-minded man to death felt inherently wrong. It took decades for that moral intuition to become enshrined in law, but eventually it did. When we look back now, Joe Arridy's story stands as a powerful lesson in humility for our justice system. It reminds us that justice is not infallible. It's a human institution with human flaws, prejudices and errors. It also teaches the importance of compassion. The way Joe was treated by Warden Best, Father Shayler, and even his fellow inmates on death row is a testament to human decency shining through in a dark situation. They treated Joe not as a monster, but as a vulnerable person in need of care, which is what he truly was. Unfortunately, that compassion did not extend to the courtroom or to the governor's office in time to save him. Joe's life was short and filled with hardship, but in telling his story, we ensure that his suffering was not in vain. The little boy who loved mud pies, the young childlike man who delighted in toy trains, the prisoner who smiled all the way through to the end, he has left a lasting imprint on Colorado's conscience and on America's legal history. In death, Joe Arridy finally found the friends and recognition that eluded him in life. His epitaph now proudly declares his innocence, and the happiest man on death row can now rest in peace, his good name restored. Well, thank you for listening. It was a long one, wasn't it? I did warn you. Yeah, wow, so many lessons to be learned through this. Please let me know your thoughts. Let me know, particularly on Spotify if you listen on there. Comment. I promise I will go in and respond to every comment under this episode on Spotify. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're not a Patreon of Seeing Red, nearly 1,000 of you are now. Yes, so many of you over there enjoying the benefits, and yeah, wow, it's just insane. So please check it out at patreon.com/seeingredpodcast. Until next time, I'll see you then. Beth will be back in 2 weeks' time. Bye.